In February 1562, an expedition set out. It was commanded by Jean Ribaut of Dieppe, a skillful sailor, a devout Protestant, a man of some diplomatic experience with a crew of about 150 men. Half of them were harquebusiers, and for the most part, old soldiers. Accompanying Ribaut was René de Laudonnière, a French Huguenot explorer and eventually the founder of the French colony of Fort Caroline in what is now Jacksonville, Florida. The pilot was a Portuguese man and boasted as the best for the journey by many. And lastly, a Calvinist preacher. Ribaut and his crew were accused of many motives for taking this voyage. The first was that they wanted to settle a foothold where they could pirate Spanish treasure ships, returning from the Caribbean, Central and South America. Secondly, the trip was funded as expectation of profit after the settlement was set up. The alleged investors were Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici, Admiral Coligny, and Monsieur de Vendôme. However, the true reason was that the Huguenots were escaping the heinous and brutal religious persecution by the Roman Catholic Church within their own homeland. Ribaut sighted the east coast of Florida May 1, 1562, where his ships entered what Ribaut named the River of May, that is now known as the St. Johns River, near modern-day Jacksonville, Florida. Ribaut also constructed a 5-sided column featuring a bronze shield bearing the coat of arms to establish the area for France. He had also made contact with the local Indians and traded for supplies. The relationship between Ribaut and the local Indians were said to be outstanding. Ribaut and his men sailed north along the coast, and they enter a harbor he names Port Royal on May 27, 1562. Ribaut erected a second stone monument on a small island in Port Royal Sound, and the settlers then built a fort and named it Charles Fort. Ribaut headed back to France, promising to return in 6 months with supplies and more settlers.
I believe that many of the men were just seamen, and they looked for adventure. I believe many understood the persecution that was going on, and they were part of this new faith, and they believed they were also chosen. They had a destiny. Remember, John Calvin was into predestination, and I think that many people that were part of this were looking for, God, what have you destined my life for? As the men came into what's now Jacksonville, the first thing they did after meeting the natives was to bow and to pray. I believe it's very clear in the journal. They knew they had a destiny also of bringing that gospel to the New World. If they didn't, obviously Jean Ribaut did. His journal is full of that. And I believe he chose some of the men. When he was in South Carolina, as he sailed north, some of the men were encouraged to stay and to be the first colonists, and they saw their destiny as being the foundation for the New World, for a whole new civilization in this new world. And you can read the passionate plea that Ribaut had for the men to stay, and I believe they all saw that destiny. It was difficult, remembering there was no civilization to come to. They didn't know if the natives would be hostile or not. Certainly they had heard stories of the brutality that had gone on with seamen that had escaped shipwrecks and been rescued. Surely they understood that Spain had attempted colonization over and over and been unsuccessful. Surely they knew there was no doctor, there was no infrastructure, there was nothing that they were used to start life. But they came prepared, some of them, to stay, as Ribault sailed back to find reinforcements for his new colony in the New World.
Once Ribault had reached France, he discovered the harbor was blocked off due to French wars of religion, primarily fought between the French Roman Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots. After discovering this, Ribault went to Dieppe to provide assistance in the protest. This forced Ribault to England in October 1562 to seek the help of Queen Elizabeth I. At first, the Queen was cooperative. However, after allegedly declining a new plan proposed by the Queen, Ribault was imprisoned for being a spy. Ribault wrote an account of the voyage, which survives only in English translation. Meanwhile, the group left at Charles Fort were struggling to survive. The men eventually gave up hope of Ribault's return and decided to build a raft from whatever materials they could find and set sail back to France. The men were eventually rescued by an English ship in July 1563. Only 7 of them survived. After the 1563 Peace of Ambrose, a new voyage to America was being prepared. This voyage was to be headed by René de Laudonnière. The trip was being set up during the fall and demise of Charles Fort. The news had reached France just before he set sail on his journey that had changed the course of the journey to the banks of the River May, also known as the St. Johns River, which is now Jacksonville, Florida.
Laudonnière also was a seaman. He had been with Ribault on the first journey. Obviously, he was chosen because he had great skills. I've read, and I believe he was a relative of Gaspar de Coligny. On the second voyage, I believe Ribault was obviously the choice. He was not available, and so Laudonnière was chosen.
Laudonnière set sail on April 22nd, 1564. The plan was for Laudonnière to go and settle first, and Ribault was to come in the spring of 1565 to replenish the settlement with reinforcements and supplies. Additionally, in May 1564, a ship commanded by Manrique de Rojas, under the orders of Philip II, the King of Spain, set sail to Charles Fort to destroy any presence of the Huguenots. June 22, 1564, the expedition with Laudonnière and his 3 ships and nearly 300 men entered the River May. The first thing Laudonnière did was reestablish the relationships with the locals. They had shown him a shrine that they had made around the monument that was left behind from Ribault's first voyage. He then began to build Fort Caroline on the south banks of the River May. In June 1564, shortly after Laudonnière landed at the River May, Rojas arrived at Port Royal. Rojas had learned that a French boy was living among the Indians. His name was Rufy, and he provided Rojas with all the information of Ribault's first voyage. Acting as a guide, Rufy took Rojas to Charles Fort, where they burnt the remaining buildings and filled the moat. Afterwards, he confiscated Ribault's monuments and set sail to Cuba on June 15, 1564. Rojas then sent word back to King Philip II about the accounts of Ribault's first voyage. Meanwhile, over the next several months, Laudonnière and his men were struggling to make it. They were running out of supplies. One vessel decided to turn and form a mutiny. Laudonnière was ultimately able to calm the ruse and execute the ringleaders.
What was. We know Laudonnière from the journals of some of the people who were there. We know Laudonnière from his journal. Many things went wrong in the colony, as they did in later colonies. The English colonies, it's almost the same pattern. When people are hungry, they don't find the wealth that they expect on the land. They're disenchanted, they turn. They came with dreams and with visions. There were different dreams. Some came for religious freedom. Some came for wealth. Some came for adventure. There's no doubt about that. They came as I said earlier, they came as Catholics, Protestants, and Muslims. In one colony, of several hundred people, that's a very diverse group of people. I believe if Ribaud had made that selection, it would have been a little bit different. But Laudonnière made that decision because he needed people on the land. He needed people to do different things. He prepared well. He was given an allotment for the food, and he bought food. I'm not sure he bought enough, but he brought food. Some had to pay their way, some came for free as laborers. He brought musicians, he brought brickmakers, he brought livestock, all the things I believe he thought he should bring on 3 ships. Again, there was mutiny. When people lose vision, they turn and do different things that would bring about that vision.
The Huguenots were expecting Ribaud to arrive in the spring. However, he did not arrive. Ribaud had gotten caught up in the battle that had just broken out in the French Civil War. He was unable to organize his fleet until the summer of 1565. In June 1565, Laudonnière had given up hope of the arrival of Ribaud and began preparations to abandon the colony. August 28, 1565, John Ribaud arrived at Fort Caroline with 5 vessels and 800 men. He relieved Laudonnière after not being able to establish a co-regency over the colony, took over as commander, and began to rebuild and reinforce Fort Caroline. Laudonnière attempted to sail back to France, however the arrival of Pedro Menendez doomed and changed his plans. During this time, the Spanish Roman Catholics, under the order of the Roman Catholic Church, had decided to eliminate the new French colony of Fort Caroline. They considered the Huguenots to be heretics and decided that they must be destroyed. They approached Menendez to set up an expedition to Florida under the condition that he seek and kill the French Huguenots. Spain was a stronghold for the RCC, and the Spanish ships and soldiers should be considered synonymous with the Roman Catholic Church. King Philip II was a Roman Catholic and a strong advocate for the Pope, and the papacy should be, for all intents and purposes, thought of as ruler de facto of Spain. Pedro Menendez came to the New World with the papal blessing, as Pope Alexander XI had bequeathed the land of America to Spain in 1493. The question must be asked, by what authority did the Pope do such a thing? Since the RCC believes that the Pope is the Vicar of Christ, or God on earth, they would believe that God gave him the authority. Pedro Menendez landed on the shores of Florida believing that not only were all non-Roman Catholics heretics, but that he was there with the authority of the Pope to exterminate them. The vehicle given to him to impose this cruelty to not only the Huguenots but to the natives was a document called the Requirimiento. The Spanish requirement of 1513, also known as the Requirimiento, was a declaration by the Spanish monarchy of its self-anointed, divinely ordained right to take possession of the territories of the New World and to subjugate, exploit, and when necessary, to fight the native inhabitants. The Requirimiento was read in Spanish to Native Americans to inform them of Spain's right to conquest. Those who subsequently resisted conquest were considered to harbor evil intentions. The Spaniards thus considered those who resisted as defying God's plan, and also used Roman Catholic theology to justify their conquest.
The Requirimiento, or literally the requirement or the command, is a document that was published in 1513, and it gave Spain the right to suppress with violence any of the indigenous peoples of the New World when it embarked on its voyages of discovery or its exploration initiatives. And what that meant was that when they arrived in the New World, they could simply declare to the indigenous population, the Indians for example, that they were there on the authority of the Pope and on the authority of the King of Spain, and therefore they had the right to come and settle this new land, and any resistance would be met with force, and if they did resist, they had the authority to kill or enslave them, and so any ill effects that resulted from their failure to cooperate was their own fault, and therefore they needed to submit. And it basically was a document to give the explorers permission to do whatever they wanted with the people of the New World. Now, that eventually was revoked, but it was only revoked in the letter, but not in the spirit, because Roman Catholicism practiced this domestically in Europe anyway. It wasn't a matter of revoking the actual principle that was behind it. It was just a matter of revoking the document. The document itself, as implemented, was actually, it was a bit of a farce, because people would read it while they were still on the ship in sight of the new land, and therefore they had fulfilled the requirements of reading the requiremento out loud, or they would read it to the indigenous population before they actually had learned Spanish, and so they were actually reading their commands to people in languages they couldn't possibly understand. And so any resistance, even if it was resistance because they didn't understand what was being required of them, could be met with the full force of the Spanish conquistadors.
Menendez was in a race to catch Ribault. Menendez's fleet attempted to grapple and board Ribault's ships just off the mouth of the River May, also known as St. John's River, but sea conditions denied success to both combatants. During Menendez's settlement of St. Augustine, Ribault took his fleet south to pursue Menendez's camp on September 10, 1565. He left Laudonnière with 100 men, but only 20 soldiers. During Ribault's attempt to attack, he was caught in a violent hurricane, almost completely destroying Ribault's fleet. The remaining survivors were washed on shore. In the same storm, Menendez set out to attack Fort Caroline after hearing of Ribault's attack. September 20, 1565, Menendez captured the lighted fort, killing most of the men. The bodies of the victims were hung in trees with the inscription, "Hanged not as Frenchmen, but as Lutherans." Laudonnière managed to escape. He made his way to the river's mouth, where Ribault's son was anchored with 3 ships. He set sail with the younger Ribault's company, but eventually headed home on a lone vessel, unexpectedly landing in Wales. Menendez would rename the fort San Mateo and planned to return to St. Augustine. On his way back, he discovered the shipwrecked survivors of Ribault's fleet. The storm had driven the French squadron many miles south toward present-day Daytona Beach, destroying all the warships. Ribault and hundreds of survivors washed ashore and began to walk north along the beach. The Spanish patrol encountered the remnants of the French force and took them prisoner. Menendez accepted their surrender. However, following the explicit orders of King Philip II, the prisoners were asked if they were professing Roman Catholics. Those who were not were marched behind a dune and put to the knife by Menendez's Spanish soldiers. All of Ribault's men captured were slaughtered except for those professing to be Roman Catholics and a few Protestant workers with useful skills. He named the area Matanzas Inlet. Matanzas is Spanish for slaughters. John Ribault, along with about 350 of his men, were executed for refusing to convert to the Roman Catholic faith, just as their fellow Huguenots had been slaughtered in Europe for the past hundreds of years. By mid-October 1565, the presence of the French Huguenots on the Florida coast had been obliterated, in accord with the wishes of Philip II of Spain.
In 1562, Jean Ribault had established the colony in Florida, and he actually referred to it as New France. And he was there under the authority of his king and actually claimed it for his king. And it was 1565 when the Spaniards arrived under the leadership of Pedro Menendez, on orders from King Philip II of Spain. And when he arrived, he actually told the Huguenots that if they would convert, anybody who would acknowledge that they were Roman Catholic would be spared, and anybody who would not acknowledge that they were Roman Catholic would be killed. And Jean Ribault sued for peace and said, "We're not at war with you. The kings of France and Spain are hermanos," is how it was recorded by the Spanish chronicler. And Menendez agreed and said, that's correct. The kings of France and Spain are not at war, and that's why we will not kill any Roman Catholics we find among you. But you Huguenots are of the new sect, and because you are of a new sect, and the Spaniards were referring to them as Lutherans at the time, but of course they were actually rather Calvinists, the Huguenots. But Lutheran was just the term that was being used to describe all Protestants, and King Philip of Spain had basically given Menendez permission to hang and to burn and to slaughter any Lutherans that he found in the New World. So when Jean Ribault sued for peace, Menendez said, I'm sorry, it's only Roman Catholics that will be spared, and the members of the new sect will be destroyed because you are of a heretical sect, and there can only be war and fire and blood between us, and we will prosecute this order on sea or on land or anywhere that we find you. So here was a situation where France and Spain were not even at war, and yet because the New World had been claimed by Spain, basically because of what the line of demarcation that had been established by the Pope, Spain considered the French to be interlopers there. But any French Catholic would be spared. And in fact, that was the case. French people that acknowledged that they were Catholics were spared. And so the fact that they had the full authority of the requirimiento to kill anybody they found there was actually interpreted in such a way that they could spare Roman Catholics. And in fact, they spared women and then children under the age of 15. And that was a crisis of conscience that Menendez acknowledged. He was very concerned that if he were to kill women and then children under the age of 15, that he would suffer judgment by the hand of God. But when it came to actually killing the grown-ups, the full-grown males who were not Roman Catholics but were indeed French Huguenots, they did not have any hesitation to hack them to pieces and kill them and hang them and burn them. And in some cases they were hurling the pieces of the Huguenots that they'd hacked in pieces. They were hurling the body parts at other Huguenots who had not yet surrendered as a means of intimidation. So the requirimiento gave comfort to the conscience of Menendez to hack the Huguenots to pieces and absolutely brutalize them, and yet gave him sufficient latitude that he actually could pardon any French Catholics he found on account of the fact that they were Catholics. So there was no actual war between Spain and France at the time, and Jean Ribault was correct that the kings of France and Spain were hermanos. But Pedro Menendez was there in order to hang and burn any Protestants that he found, and that's exactly what he did.
The men were taken in groups of 10, so they were manageable. They believed they were being taken, they were surrendering and their lives would be saved. So they were taken to St. Augustine. And I think from journals of those who did survive, they believed that they would eventually end up in France. So their hands were tied behind their backs. They were marched towards St. Augustine, but the line had been drawn in the sand. And at that point, when they got to that line, the Spanish soldiers were told to slaughter the men. So there in groups of 10, the men died in the sand. So we don't know how many men in each group, but I would think, from what I read, more than 100 in that first group. The second group approached days later, and in that group was Jean Ribault. And that was what Pedro Menendez was looking for. He knew that he was a worthy opponent, and that if he did not find Ribault, that this war could go on for a long time. So Ribault approached the inlet, and there, if I understand the journals, and there are different journals, for more than a day and a half negotiations went on. According to Pedro Menendez's journal, he never said that any lives would be saved. He just simply said that what God would have done to them would be done. So finally Ribault put down his arms, crossed over, and met with Pedro Menendez. There, Ribault knelt in the sand and was asked to repent of his heretic religion and to live, or otherwise he would die there. Jean Ribault did the most amazing thing I've seen of someone who's willingly giving up their life. he refused to recant. He knelt there and began quoting Psalm 132. Now, I've read a translation of the Spanish that says that doesn't exist, and I've read different translations. We now know Psalm 132 says what David said to God, Lord, remember me in my afflictions. And then it says, I'll not go to my bed chamber or rest my eyes in sleep until I find a resting place for the mighty God of Jacob. Once again, Rimbaud was looking at his destiny. He had come to find a resting place, a place for the people of God. He had no choice now than to recant what he had said, or to say, God, it's in your hands. You see my affliction. I submit to you. And he did submit to him. And with that, he was speared through. With that, I believe he made covenant for our nation with God. He had fulfilled his destiny. I don't believe he knew that was going to be his destiny, but a man was willing to submit to that. And there at Matanzas, more than 300 men did the same. And their blood was shed in a place we call Matanzas, place of slaughter. And Menendez moved forward in creation of his colony and a place that had no freedom of worship. And for almost 200 years, La Florida would be a place only of Catholics. Protestants were not allowed to worship or reside in La Florida. And then again, after the British occupation, this land was Catholic, and it was protected from those who would come outside the Catholic Church. They were not allowed to reside on the land of Florida. So even though it looked as if the vision and the destiny of Jean Rimbaud and these Huguenots was lost at that place, we today live in the freedom that they lived and died for.
Many Protestant martyrs, but all they needed was permission, and they needed to believe that they were doing this for the will of God, and it was necessary for the advance of the gospel for this to be done. Menendez actually wrote to King Philip later and asked that he send some Jesuits who could actually preach the gospel to the natives in Florida. And this is after the slaughter of the Huguenots. And he believed that he was just there as a minister of the gospel, and he had basically cleared the way for true evangelization to take place. And so he actually wrote to King Philip, asked him to send Jesuits there to do the preaching, and even confessed that he had done all that he could to train the Indians in true Christianity, but he was pretty much at the end of his abilities to do any further instruction and needed the professionals to come in and back him up. So here's a guy who, on paper, would say to the king, now I've cleared the way for you to come, send the Jesuits so they can actually teach the indigenous people here, after having enacted a brutal slaughter, a brutal massacre of Protestants who he found in Florida.
The Protestant Huguenots that fled Europe in the mid-1500s were looking for freedom to read their Bibles and to worship God in a new world, and not to be subjects of popery. But that was not to be. Some may ask why anyone would care about this story that happened 450 years ago. This is ancient history, right? Well, the fact is the Roman Catholic Church still has the same beliefs today as they did when they decided to use their puppet Pedro Menendez of Spain, through their advocate King Philip II, to slaughter the Huguenots on the shores of Florida. This story is a microcosm of the brutality that engulfed Europe in the Dark Ages and is still alive and well today.